Welcome to the Octagon Edge, where you find every update on the UFC and MMA world.
What if I told you that fighters are secretly recording training sessions with champions and using the footage to boost their own careers? And that's just the beginning of the toxic culture that's been exposed behind the scenes in mixed martial arts. From young prospects disrespecting legends in their own gyms, to champions flip-flopping on major fights for the most ridiculous reasons, the MMA world has become a playground for ego-driven drama that makes reality TV look tame by comparison.
The most shocking revelation comes from Aljamain Sterling, who just exposed the disturbing behavior of 18-year-old Raul Rosas Jr. during what was supposed to be a routine training session. Sterling revealed that Rosas Jr.'s parents were secretly recording their grappling session without permission, turning what should have been a respectful learning opportunity into a content creation scheme. But it gets even worse than that. Sterling described how Rosas Jr. was literally breakdancing and trying to DJ on his head during the session, showing complete disrespect to a reigning UFC champion.
The audacity of this behavior becomes even more infuriating when you realize that Sterling was having a light training day because he was still sore from a brutal week of preparation. This kid essentially took advantage of a champion's recovery session to show off for his parents' camera, treating one of the most skilled grapplers in the sport like a prop in his personal highlight reel. Sterling admitted he just laid back and let it happen because he couldn't believe what was actually occurring. The fact that an 18-year-old thought this was acceptable behavior shows how warped the culture has become.
But the disrespect didn't stop there. Sterling also called out Rosas Jr. for training with Merab Dvalishvili one weekend, then immediately working with Sean O'Malley the following weekend right before their championship fight. This level of camp hopping violated the unwritten code that every fighter should understand. Sterling compared it to Gordon Ryan's controversial decision to train with both Luke Rockhold and Chris Weidman before they fought each other, calling the whole situation uncomfortable and awkward.
What makes this even more problematic is that Rosas Jr. clearly doesn't understand the politics and respect that should exist in high-level training environments. Sterling mentioned that when he sees Rosas Jr. now, he doesn't even acknowledge him, though he still says hello to his parents and sister out of basic human decency. The breakdown in their relationship shows how quickly disrespectful behavior can burn bridges with established champions who could have been valuable mentors.
Meanwhile, Alexander Pantoja just demonstrated the exact opposite problem that's plaguing modern MMA: champions who are terrified of taking real risks. After initially shutting down any talk of fighting Merab Dvalishvili, Pantoja suddenly changed his tune and started entertaining the superfight idea. His reasoning reveals everything wrong with championship mentality today. He's asking why he should move up to bantamweight when he still has challenges in his own division, essentially admitting he's looking for the easiest path possible.
Pantoja specifically mentioned fighters like Muhammad Mokaev and Tyra as legitimate challengers, but then immediately started talking about how exciting a fight with Merab would be. The flip-flopping shows a champion who's more interested in generating headlines than actually clearing out his division. His comment about rolling the dice on the Merab fight proves that he's treating championship opportunities like gambling rather than serious competitive challenges that require proper preparation and commitment.
The hypocrisy becomes even more obvious when you consider that Pantoja is essentially admitting other fighters deserve opportunities in his division, but he's willing to abandon them for a bigger payday against Merab. This mentality is exactly why divisions get clogged up with deserving contenders, while champions chase money fights that make no sense from a competitive standpoint. Pantoja's wishy-washy approach to major decisions shows why some champions never achieve true legendary status. But perhaps the most embarrassing moment of the week belonged to Daniel Cormier, who got absolutely roasted by Chael Sonnen for butchering fighters' names during his analysis. Sonnen hilariously pointed out that Cormier created 3 completely new human beings in the UFC by mispronouncing names so badly that they became entirely different people. Cormier apparently called someone Robert Barral when discussing middleweights and referred to another fighter as Ritter instead of their actual name.
Sonnen's response was pure comedy gold, suggesting that Cormier has become like a wrestling manager who just makes up names for his fighters and expects everyone to go along with it. The joke about fighters accepting whatever name Cormier gives them and following him blindly was both hilarious and accurate. For someone who's paid to be a professional analyst, the level of preparation and attention to detail that Cormier displayed was genuinely embarrassing for someone of his stature in the sport. The roasting session exposed a bigger problem with MMA commentary and analysis. Too many former fighters are getting analyst jobs based purely on their fighting credentials rather than their actual knowledge or preparation. When you're mispronouncing names of active UFC fighters badly enough that you're essentially creating fictional people, it raises serious questions about how much homework these analysts are actually doing before going on air. Meanwhile, Gene Silva dropped one of the most ominous predictions in recent memory when discussing his upcoming fight with Diego Lopes. Silva claimed that Lopes basically signed his own coffin by accepting the fight and making public statements about wanting to face him. The dark imagery wasn't accidental. Silva genuinely believes this fight will end Lopes's career trajectory in a devastating way that will require putting dirt on that coffin. Silva's comments went beyond typical fight promotion into genuinely personal territory. He admitted that he simply doesn't like Lopes as a person, comparing their relationship to family members in Brazil whose saints don't match. According to Silva, some people just have incompatible auras, and in their line of work, that incompatibility can be resolved through violence. The casual way he discussed beating someone up because their personalities don't mesh reveals the darker psychological aspects of professional fighting.
What makes Silva's predictions even more chilling is his confidence about fighting for the title next if he wins. He specifically mentioned that Alexander Volkanovski has already stated in interviews that he expects Silva to win and face him for the championship by the end of the year. Silva boldly declared that Brazil will have its first featherweight champion since Jose Aldo, putting enormous pressure on himself to deliver a spectacular performance against Lopes.
But the most controversial lifestyle revelation came from Carlos Prates, who openly admitted that he regularly drinks alcohol and smokes cigarettes despite being a professional fighter. Prates acknowledged that he's been smoking since he was 12 years old and considers it part of his identity that he refuses to change for his fighting career. His attitude toward his vices shows a level of self-destructive behavior that's rare among elite athletes. Prates specifically advised other fighters not to follow his example, essentially admitting that his lifestyle choices are detrimental to his performance while refusing to change them. He emphasized that fans want to see the real Carlos Prates, not a fake version who's cleaned up his act for professional success. This mentality reveals how some fighters prioritize authenticity over optimization, potentially limiting their competitive ceiling. The drinking and smoking admission becomes even more problematic when you consider that Prates just suffered his first UFC loss to Ian Gary. He admitted that he made strategic mistakes in that fight and was overconfident about getting a knockout. The lifestyle factors he refuses to address could be directly contributing to decision-making problems and conditioning issues that cost him important victories against elite competition.
Perhaps the most bizarre claim of the week came from Rampage Jackson, who insists that Jon Jones was genuinely scared of him before their 2011 fight. Rampage specifically mentioned that Jones didn't want to do stare-downs and displayed unusual behavior that convinced him fear was a factor. According to Rampage, Jones actually crawled during one of their face-offs, which he'd never seen before, and considered completely out of character.
Rampage's theory about fear giving fighters an adrenaline boost that makes them more dangerous is actually scientifically sound. But applying it to Jon Jones seems like revisionist history. Jones dominated that fight and submitted Rampage in the 4th round, hardly the performance of someone who was paralyzed by fear. Rampage's insistence that he could tell Jones was scared just by looking at him seems more like an attempt to preserve his own ego than an accurate assessment of his opponent's mental state. Rampage's theory about fear giving fighters an adrenaline boost that makes them more dangerous is actually scientifically sound, but applying it to John Jones seems like revisionist history. Jones dominated that fight and submitted Rampage in the 4th round, hardly the performance of someone who was paralyzed by fear. Rampage's insistence that he could tell Jones was scared just by looking at him seems more like an attempt to preserve his own ego than an accurate assessment of his opponent's mental state.
But the most concerning story involves Charles Oliveira's decision to accept a fight against Rafael Fiziev just 3 months after getting brutally knocked out by Ilia Topuria. Daniel Cormier expressed serious concerns about the quick turnaround, questioning whether Oliveira's team is properly protecting him from making dangerous decisions. Cormier pointed out that fighters will always want to fight, but it's the responsibility of coaches and managers to sometimes say no.
The timeline becomes even more troubling when you consider the severity of Oliveira's knockout against Topuria. Cormier described it as being knocked out before he even hit the ground, emphasizing how devastating the impact was on Oliveira's brain. The fact that he's rushing back into competition after such trauma raises serious questions about long-term health consequences and whether short-term financial gains are worth the potential permanent damage. Cormier's concerns are particularly valid given Oliveira's fighting style throughout his championship reign. Even when he was winning fights, Oliveira was getting dropped and hurt regularly, showing that his chin had already taken significant damage before the Topuria knockout. Adding another potential concussion to that accumulated trauma in such a short time frame seems like a recipe for career-ending consequences that could affect his quality of life long after fighting.
All of these controversies paint a picture of a sport that's struggling with fundamental issues of respect, safety, and professional standards. From young fighters secretly recording champions to veterans making claims about past opponents, the culture has become increasingly toxic and self-serving. Champions are flip-flopping on major decisions based on financial considerations rather than competitive logic, while fighters are making lifestyle choices and comeback decisions that prioritize short-term gains over long-term health and career sustainability.
The common thread running through all these stories is a lack of accountability and proper guidance from the people who should be protecting these athletes' best interests. Whether it's parents filming secret training sessions, coaches allowing dangerous comeback timelines, or analysts showing up unprepared for their professional responsibilities. The infrastructure around MMA has become as dysfunctional as the personalities it's supposed to support. Until these fundamental culture problems are addressed, we'll continue seeing the sport eat its own through disrespect, poor decision-making, and ego-driven conflicts that serve no one's long-term interests.